Since the horrific terrorist attacks by Hamas in Israel on October 7th, there's been a wave of anti-Semitism in different parts of the world, including here in the United States.
So let's call this what it is, and it's anti-Semitism. It's not anything to do with Israel or Palestine. Like, we're using that now as a platform, but that's not the root of the issue.
On this episode, we speak with a local Jewish leader who is in Israel on the day of the attack to hear his story of getting his family to safety and to discuss how Americans can push back against the examples of anti-Semitism we keep seeing in the news and defend America's founding ideals of freedom and pluralism. You're listening to Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and this week we're talking about the very concerning rise in anti-Semitism across the world and here in the United States. And we're pleased to be joined by our special guest, Rabbi Chaim Zippel, who is the co-director of Chabad of Utah County. Rabbi, thanks so much for joining us on Defending Ideas.
Thanks for having me.
And also joined again by Bill Duncan, who's the Constitutional Law and Religious Freedom Fellow here at Sutherland Institute.
Thanks, Nick.
So the reason I wanted to talk to both of you gentlemen together is, Rabbi Zippel, your experiences with what happened in Israel on October 7th are, I think, compelling and worth sharing with our listeners, and also your perspective on what's been going on since then. And Bill, with your expertise looking at the issue of religious liberty in this country through the historical lens, you wrote a great piece for our Insights blog about anti-Semitism here in the States. So I want to get to both of those. And maybe to start off, Rabbi Zippel, you were in Israel on October 7th with your wife and your baby. Can you share for us what that experience was like?
Sure. In the Jewish culture, there's something called a bar mitzvah. Bar mitzvah is when a boy turns 13. It's when he becomes what Judaism will recognize as becoming a man, and it'll usually be a big celebration, bunch of gifts, iPads, stuff like that, depending on the family. So my brother-in-law chose, instead of having a big party here in the States, to go as a family to Israel, and to instead of having a big party, just to go around and visit a bunch of different family we have there and to spend time together as a family. So we were here hosting services and programs in our community for most of their trip, and we joined for the last week of it, which is over the Jewish holiday of Sukkot. We went all around. We were in Jerusalem a little bit. We were in the Golan in northern Israel. We were in Tiberias, which is also northern Israel. And for the last days, we spent the final day, which is the Jewish holiday Simchat Torah, which was October 7th. We spent in southern Israel in a city called Omer, which is about a couple minutes from Beersheba.
So what you've shared your account for some news outlets immediately after the horrific terrorist attacks by Hamas on October 7th. Kind of walk us through what you were doing when it first started, and then what you experienced and kind of what happened next.
Sure. I'm an American citizen, so I've actually only been to Israel just a few times. So the whole concept of running for cover when you hear an alarm all of a sudden is something that's completely foreign. So it was 6:30 in the morning and I slept through it. All of a sudden, my mother-in-law comes pounding on the door, yelling something, and our baby was sleeping. And I'm like, what's going on? And she tells us in Hebrew, there's an azakah, which is an azakah is a red alert siren, and we got to get to the bomb shelter. We grab the baby and run downstairs, sort of confused because it's not in the realm of normal for us. But I wouldn't say we were too concerned, just because, as unfortunate as it is, like, this is a sense of normal for the citizens in Israel, and particularly southern Israel. Every few weeks, months, there'll be a little bit of a flare-up, some rockets, IDF will respond, and people will sort of just go on with their lives. So we ran. The bomb shelter is in the basement, so we ran in and out 2, 3, 4 times. We heard the sirens. We heard very loud booms, probably not too far from us. But that was it. We weren't too concerned. It was just okay, you know?
At what point did you have the realization that this was different? This wasn't like you described some of the other past conflicts where there were some rocket attacks. When did you and your family realize this is actually a lot different, a lot more serious?
it's important to point out that religious Jews do not use electronics on a holiday. So we had no phones on, no TV on. Typically, when these things will happen in Israel, people will be glued to their televisions. We didn't have that. So at 9 a.m., this all started at 6:30. At 9 a.m., we went and we headed for synagogue. It's one of the most joyous days on the calendar. We said more than ever, let's go and let's cheer everybody up, dance, have a good time. And we were walking the street, me and my 17-year-old brother-in-law, and this Israeli comes like driving up right next to us, one hand on his steering wheel, one hand on like massive gun on his side, and he tells me in Hebrew, there's a balagan, there's chaos, and you guys should not be in the streets. There's terrorists coming into the communities. We don't know where they are. They could be here. Don't be in the street. Get back home. Literally almost straight out of a movie. As he finished speaking, there was a large boom right in front of us with black smoke, and we just ran back home and spent the rest of the day in and out of the bomb shelter.
Well, when did you start to realize, hey, maybe we just need to get out of Israel? You've shared before the account of sort of the stress of trying to get your wife and your baby out.
So we didn't know what was going on. I had a flight for Thursday, like 5 days later, and I said, maybe I'll call Delta and get them to move us. By the time we turned our phones on, every flight out of the country was canceled that was not on El Al, Israel's local airline. So it was clear that we had to do whatever we can to get out. We just didn't know if it would be at all possible. We weren't eating properly. The baby couldn't sleep properly because it was just running in and out of the shelter. It was levels of anxiety was not very healthy. So I reached out to a travel agent and I said, send me anywhere. And he called me an hour later. He's like, I need an answer within the minute. I have a flight to Switzerland. Do you want it? Take it or leave it. So I was like, even still, I was like, I'll take it, but what happens if it doesn't go? He's like, no, I promise you it's going to go. So I said, okay, we got to do what we can. And we took it and we left.
So when was your flight out? Was it later that day or the next day?
It was Monday at 8 a.m. So we left. We spent the whole Sunday still in Israel, still in basically in the house. We didn't go anywhere. All the stores were closed. You didn't feel safe to be in the street at all. We headed for the airport at 3 a.m. on Monday morning, Sunday night. We had to make a last-second judgment call whether or not to go, because all of a sudden then is when Hamas started shooting rockets at the airport, a couple hundred of them. And we had to practice how it works if we're driving on the highway and there's a red alert. What do you do with the baby? You put the blanket on the floor and the baby, and you sort of get on top of the baby for cover, like things that you never imagine having to think about in America.
What did it feel like when you finally got on the plane and were leaving, or did you end up going to Switzerland after all? I mean, landing in Switzerland or coming back home to the States, how did it feel when that moment arrived, when you realized my family's safe?
It didn't. I expected to have a much stronger feeling about it. We stuck, which was probably a bad call. We stayed at an airport hotel in Switzerland. We were there for 24 hours. And the whole time when we were in southern Israel, the whole day we heard planes flying above us, like fighter planes. So like every time during the night, we'd hear a plane taking off in our, again, bad judgment call in our airport hotel. It sort of brings back a level of anxiety. You're riding the train, you see people looking at you. Even getting back to the States, like it didn't carry immediately that sense of relief. It took some time to be able to like breathe, let it out, and even still, like it's a scary reality a lot of Jews live with still day by day, but definitely took a few days to have that sense of relief.
I appreciate you walking us through that. I can only imagine how stressful and scary that would be. And I mean, seeing the aftermath now, I think it's important for our listeners to kind of hear your experience on the ground in Israel when the attacks were occurring, and then help use that as an anchor point for how we understand and discuss the issue moving forward. And especially as we'll focus the bulk of our conversation on sort of this really shocking and concerning and confusing, for that matter, wave of anti-Semitism since then. And so as we get into that, I want to ask, what is something about what occurred on October 7th that you think Americans need to remember as we're seeing discussions happen on the public square about, even the nature of Israel's military response, or any of the commentary around the decades of conflict on this issue? What's a really important principle that Americans need to make sure they don't forget if we're going to be talking about these other issues?
I think the important point to hold on to, and this is complicated, is the brutality of it. And what I mean by that is, why is it complicated? Because the IDF actually has footage. We read yesterday on social media that there were certain members of Congress that sat down and were shown different raw footage from that day that the IDF is shielding the public from seeing. Because I think very much unlike Hamas, they're trying to protect the dignity here of what went on and not use every tool at their disposal to horrify people and to show like, hey, these are really bad people, even though they can. But I think that is sort of what people need to see more of and to hear more of, that this wasn't a military operation on an army base in Israel. This was, they chose ways to harm as many civilians as possible in the most brutal way possible. Obviously targeting a music festival and the more you read about it, the way that they went about it to make sure that you scare people so they start running in one direction and then you're there waiting for them to attack them or again, I don't want to get into too many of the atrocities, but babies in ovens and the like. It's the brutality of it. There is nothing that will ever warrant such behavior. Nothing, regardless of any background.
Rabbi, I appreciate you. Again, these are, I'm sure, difficult things to talk about, but I think important things for Americans to understand because it helps frame the rest of the entire issue, the rest of the discussion. We're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, I want to broaden the conversation to what has the response been in the Western world, and especially in the United States, because I think those of us who are observing it is horrifying and shocking and concerning on a number of levels with the examples of anti-Semitism we've seen, and we'll talk about some of those and get into that about what can we do as Americans to push back against this kind of anti-Semitism domestically. So I want to ask you about that, and we'll talk with Bill as well about what he's written and some of that analysis from the religious pluralism perspective that America does and ought to stand for. So we'll take a quick break. This is Defending Ideas. Stick around.
Sutherland Institute is an independent, nonprofit public policy think tank based in Salt Lake City, Utah. Our mission is to defend the principles of the American founding and strengthen the institutions of civil society essential for those principles to endure. Sutherland provides research, events, and multimedia to policymakers and the public to promote the principles of faith, family, freedom, opportunity, and responsibility. Visit SutherlandInstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and our guests this week have been Rabbi Chaim Zippel and Bill Duncan here at the Sutherland Institute, and Rabbi Zippel of the Chabad of Utah County. And we're going to continue our conversation about the aftermath of the horrific terrorist attacks by Hamas on October 7th in Israel, and what the response has been in the United States in the context of rising waves of anti-Semitism. We're going to get into that, but first, before we continue the conversation, I want to mention, if you're enjoying this episode, I want to encourage you to visit us at defendingideas.org. On that page, you can find access to clips from this episode and previous shows that you can use on social media and in your conversations with friends and family. You can also subscribe to this podcast on Apple, Google, Spotify, essentially any of the major platforms. Wherever you like to get your shows, just go to the search bar and plug in Defending Ideas and hit that subscribe button. That's defendingideas.org. Rabbi Zippel and Bill, we want to now shift the conversation into sort of this broader focus on what's going on in the Western world and in the United States now in the aftermath of these horrific attacks on October 7th. And there's a piece from National Review that's essentially just trying to create a running tally of all of the examples of anti-Semitism that have been happening. And we'll link to this in the show notes for our listeners. I want to preface this by saying that it is both utterly bizarre and horrifying that in the aftermath of the most massive and brutal slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust, that anti-Semitism is on the rise, that folks whose people were a victim of this are now being victimized continuously in other ways. And so with that preface, here's some examples of some of the kinds of things that are going on. And again, we'll link to this in the show notes. I'm just going to read a few headlines. We won't get into the details, but just to give a flavor of what's happening. Cornell cancels classes after student arrested for anti-Semitic threats of murder and rape. Indianapolis woman arrested for plowing car into building she thought was a Jewish school. Israeli Harvard Business School student accosted and harassed amid Gaza die-in. Israeli student assaulted at Columbia University after posting photos of Hamas hostages. And Jewish cemetery in Cleveland vandalized with swastika graffiti. There are dozens of these, and there are more examples than just this article holds. We've seen a lot of the videos. We've seen things on social media about protests and on college campuses and law schools. Their students doing things and saying things that seem to minimize. And so I just want to give a flavor of that. And Rabbi Zippel, maybe starting with you, what's your reaction to all of this?
My reaction is that it's important that we point these things out. It's tough to read about, and I usually am reminding our community that it's best to not spend a ton of time on social media. It's going to leave you feeling not very well mentally, but it's important that there is documentation of this, and it's important that we realize that this is a reality, because very often when there's conflict in Israel, or even in the beginning of this very conflict, the reaction you'll hear from people on the very high up levels will be, this is only a ground dispute. This is a discussion about Israel versus Palestine. This is not any issue of anti-Semitism. This has nothing to do with the Jewish people. This is all about land. And each and every one of these headlines explain to you how that's absolutely not true. None of these attacks happened against Israeli politicians or the Israeli government, or many of them not even against Israeli people. Some of these people may have never in their life been to Israel. One of the headlines was about the woman ramming her car into a building she thought was a Jewish preschool. If I got that right. Kids that live in America very likely have never been to Israel. So let's call this what it is, and it's anti-Semitism. It's not anything to do with Israel or Palestine. Like, we're using that now as a platform, but that's not the root of the issue.
Bill, I want to bring you into the conversation and ask, especially with your lens, with your expertise looking at religious freedom issues in the United States and beyond for many, many years, this seems like one of the most potent examples of Americans doing the exact opposite of embracing this idea of religious freedom, religious pluralism. Why is this happening in the United States? Can you make any sense of it?
It's hard to make sense of. I agree entirely with everything that Rabbi Zippel said. It's startling. One of the reasons Sutherland wanted to weigh in as quickly as we did on this is that in a moment like this, it's never appropriate just to let something happen without making a comment. And we talk about issues of tolerance and respect for the beliefs of others. And in a moment like that, we felt we needed to say something. And but to answer your question about why it's happening. I think that I don't know the answer entirely. I mean, in a lot of ways, it seems like anti-Semitism, which is in many ways much worse than the normal quote unquote kind of religious hostility we sometimes see. I don't agree with you, or I think you're practicing your beliefs is uncomfortable to me. This is more virulent, and so I think that's an important point. But it seems like these things are. In a normal time, you think of people with these horrible beliefs as being kind of dwelling underground, and maybe cranks or conspiracy theorists or things, and then all of a sudden you recognize, well, actually, these kinds of things are emerging, and in some of our elite institutions, it's as troubling as any other development. I think at least here in the United States to see that happen. Why? I think that I personally think that there's been an increase in just disregard for human life, and I think a shocking historical ignorance. I remember, if you maybe a little bit of a personal story. I remember my mom taking me to the Holocaust Museum in Los Angeles. I grew up in Southern California when I was very little, and it was, of course, a very striking experience. I wasn't very very old at the time. And, just that sense as you leave, this can never happen again. This can never happen again. Then to see that there are people who are minimizing or seem to even not even know what happened, that's the kind of thing I think that perhaps is contributing to this. We just have become too willing to forget lessons we should have learned and things that really ought to be unspeakable, or attitudes or beliefs that ought not to have any place in our consciousness and our hearts, but they're back, and so Rabbi Zippel is exactly right. We have to be aware of this. I think we have to I think you used the word document that. I think that's exactly right. And recognize that there's a teaching responsibility that all of us have to ensure that those lessons, not only of world policy now, but of history, we're going to have to bring those to the fore again.
I want to just piggyback for 1 second. Sometimes you see one of these lines on social media, and it's rare, but it gets it on the button. So one of the lines people have been using is "never again is now." I don't know if you came across that. For years, people have been saying to their kids, people have been saying to the public, people have been saying, politicians have been saying, government officials, everybody has been saying, never again, never again. The Holocaust, we can never let it happen again. People have asked, how did it happen? How did it happen? I know on a local level, 2 months ago, maybe, I was speaking with a community member and told me, like, you think you're safe and something like this could happen here, it could happen any minute. And you're like, what are you talking about? And right now, that issue is at the forefront. By the way, just a couple of days after October 7th, there was a gentleman from New York who celebrated his 90th birthday by taking all of his kids, grandkids, and great-grandkids on a trip to Poland and Germany, where they walked through all the different sites that he survived. He went through the Holocaust. He was one of the younger survivors, and he was able to come back as a triumph of hope and to show what his response was and how many of his offspring. It was a huge, there's a picture of it. It's huge. These two issues are very directly correlated. And right now, the response will actually dictate in America, in Israel, is it true? Is it never again? Or are we going to watch atrocities we have not seen since the Holocaust? The greatest death of Jewish people since the Holocaust, are we going to watch that happen and let people celebrate it?
Both of you are pinpointing something that I assume is a common experience for many Americans. So it's certainly my experience. But what you're both articulating for years, when I was growing up and learning about the history of the Holocaust, and I would always think, how horrific and evil it was, but also that question of how could that happen? How could something like that happen in westernized civilization? And just always kind of having that puzzling, it's history. Of course, something that could never happen now. But then exactly what you both are saying, seeing the reaction from many folks in America, and in some instances, leaders of major institutions like universities or law schools, with what they say, and some of the messages from protesters and people on social media, it kind of gave me this realization is like, now I understand, which is a horrific realization to have, that these kinds of opinions and views and messages being shared far and wide creates that feeling of these are sort of the foundations or the seeds or the trend lines that lead to this kind of thing that's horrific. And so there's a little bit of this, what is happening in our country and our major institutions that these kinds of viewpoints are becoming so pronounced? I don't know if widespread is the right term, just because there's a scale question, but certainly prominent. Bill, you wrote recently on the Insights blog here at Sutherland a piece about this, and we'll link to this in the show notes as well. And I want to read an excerpt of that, and Bill, ask you to expand on it, and Rabbi Zippel, get your reaction to it. Bill, you write, one of the most heartbreaking aspects of the current war for Americans is to see other Americans, including in our universities, applaud, justify, or attempt to provide context in ways that minimize moral depravities that can never be excused. This is heartbreaking because it is such a direct repudiation of the aspirations at the core of our nation's noblest aspirations, including religious freedom. Bill, can you expand on that a little bit? It's sort of, again, this echoing of this is horrifying, but it's also a direct rejection of a core American idea.
Well, in the article, there's a story I love about George Washington at the very outset. This is prior to the First Amendment, actually. So after the new government has been organized, George Washington's visiting Providence, Rhode Island, and many of the people there, of course, are excited this visit of the president, and they have these formal kind of addresses to the president. And among those was from the local Jewish congregation in Providence, and it's a George Washington gets some credit for what he said, but he was really he was really repeating things in the letter to him that are so powerful, and that that Jewish people in the United States should have no fear of being treated as they have been in other nations in Europe, and that was the promise. And I think most Americans at least resonate to that. That's exactly right. Now, honestly, America hasn't done always great on that, right? There's been official anti-Semitism. I give an example from the Civil War, and there have been more recent ones, and then of course just attitudes of demeaning attitudes that have been manifest through time. But I think we've always thought of ourselves as being somewhat above all of that, and to feel that that's not entirely true. There's certainly some very positive things we've seen. The rally earlier this week, it was positive. I think that people were supportive, as not violent, but.
Can you specify? Sorry to interrupt, but that rally was in Washington D.C. On behalf of Israel, right?
Right,
Some
exactly.
context for that.
And bipartisan. I mean, all of the kinds of things we would want to see. So there are some positive elements, but. Again, when you see something so horrible come up as out of again the category of what you think of as cranks or unhinged people, be on billboards or on poster boards and things, and again the point is that there's no excuse. There's never an excuse for actions or attitudes like this. And to say, oh, well, if you understand no, there's no context for murdering people, innocent people. There's no context for harming children. Nothing will ever justify that. We, of course, as a nation, we'll have all kinds of questions about how we should run our foreign policy and all of those things. That's fine. But there are lines that we have to be aware that the American people, in order to be a decent, civilized nation, have to never cross, and to see that those have been crossed in some instances. Hopefully, there'll be some people who realize the enormity of what they've been excusing and step back. We pray that will happen, but we have to confront that and to say, no, this is completely at odds with everything that we should believe and should commit ourselves to.
Rabbi Zippel, before we go to break, I want to ask for your reaction to that. In the last segment, I want to talk through some of those things. What can we do as Americans to push back against this kind of anti-Semitism and stand up for those American ideals? But Rabbi, what's your reaction to what Bill wrote about and what he just articulated, that this bedrock principle of the American idea of religious freedom, religious pluralism, and protecting the inherent dignity of all people? How would you agree that these examples of anti-Semitism kind of fly in the face of that? And what context do you think around that specifically is helpful for us to recognize how I guess concerning and dangerous this moment is, which obligates us to respond in the right way?
The U.S. has a particularly special friendship with Israel, which the politicians will always repeat, correct? Why? There's tons of countries in the world, hundreds. Why? Why Israel? And correct me if I'm wrong, this is something that you guys will be more familiar with than I am. The reason for that is because Israel represents a lot of what America stands for in the Middle East. In a region that doesn't have a lot of it, Israel will stand for religion, religious freedom, and a lot of the positive parts of democracy that come along with that. And I think that is also clear in the different types of protests we've been seeing. Bill mentioned the protests in Washington. There was 290,000 people there, was the metric that I saw. No violence, zero violence, zero calls for violence, zero trespassing in areas they shouldn't have even been. Everything was in a way of peace and love and unity, actually. Different types of people, not only Jewish people. People that respect the Jewish faith, people that are friendly towards the Jewish faith, and every different type of people flew in from Israel, from New York, from Utah, people flew in from everywhere. Compare that with some of the protest videos you'll see online and how those go. Because religion is a key, important piece of American democracy, of being good people, of being people that we want our kids to be, and being people that respect law enforcement and respect a system, a process. And I think that is very much, just as much as Israel right now is fighting for their homeland, that principle is also being fought right now.
Well, in our third segment together, we'll talk about what can we do to fight for that principle, because I like that parallel you articulated, that the people of Israel today are fighting for their homeland, as you said, to have protection and security for the people and prevent future attacks like this. And so maybe the parallel for us domestically is there is maybe an ideological fight here in the United States for this principle of religious freedom and pluralism and tolerance and respect and love, frankly, that it's obviously not a kinetic conflict here, again, with some exceptions of some actual violence occurring, but it's a conflict of ideas that we need to be willing to step up to protect and defend the kind of ideals that America was founded on. And as you mentioned, some of the things that Israel replicates and stands for as well. So let's talk through some of that. Let's give some talking points to our listeners and maybe sort of a dose of optimism, because in the aftermath of tragedy, it is very easy to feel pessimistic. But I think that hopefulness that you've started to articulate is something that's very helpful in these kinds of circumstances. So we'll get to that and then finish our conversation off in a few minutes with that segment. So this is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back. Stick around.
For a deeper dive into the issues you care about, read Sutherland Institute's official blog, Insights and Takeaways. You'll gain deep insights from policy experts and relevant takeaways voters need to know. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. We're going to finish off our conversation with Rabbi Chaim Zippel and Bill Duncan about the wave of anti-Semitism here in the United States. But just want to remind you, if you like this episode, please visit defendingideas.org. You can find episodes like this and other episodes on other topics. You can find short clips that you can share on social media. And also, you can subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Google, Spotify, any of the major platforms. Just go to whichever provider you use to listen to your shows, search for Defending Ideas, and hit subscribe. That's defendingideas.org. Rabbi Zippel and Bill, as we finish off our conversation, I want to ask you both to kind of condense some of what we've been talking about into a couple really good, kind of punchy takeaways for our listeners that they can remember when they engage in these kinds of conversations. And the first thing I want to ask you is, why are these recent examples of anti-Semitism so harmful, not just to the Jewish community, but also to American ideals? Rabbi?
America is the land of the free. It's a place where we hope to raise our kids feeling free to express themselves in a way that is fitting. And I would say that more than just leaving that open-ended, we encourage religion. We encourage people to live lives that are centered around God, and it helps people live lives with purpose and lives that are not void of anything. And if we're setting a precedent where it's not safe to do so, it's scary what can come next.
Bill, same question. Why are these examples of anti-Semitism so harmful to the American ideal?
That answer is perfect, I think. And the only thing maybe I would add is that Jewish Americans are Americans. They deserve the respect, the human decency that we should treat everybody with. When we make an exception, quote unquote, in our minds of maybe someone is not worthy of respect or dignity, we've undercut that for everybody. That's 100% against what we believe as Americans, and so we have to be careful never to walk down that road.
Rabbi, how do we, those of us American citizens who believe in these American ideals, how can we push back against anti-Semitism like this when it arises?
Education. Support education. As far as I've seen, the people that you come across in social media, and you can only assume the same people are protesting because you probably are not having too much of a lengthy conversation with them, are people that really are not educated on what's going on. And I would go as far as to say there's a certain level of brainwashed. We mentioned before, when I came back, there was a lot of media coverage, and I happened to come across, as much as I try to avoid it, a comment from one person that wrote like, very believable. He even threw in some Hebrew words to make it sound as if this experience happened. We're not doubting whether or not there's war happening in Israel. We're even doubting whether this American citizen coming back and telling you his experiences in Utah, our neighbors, we're doubting if he's telling the truth. And it's important that we educate people on what's going on, what has happened, what is happening, and more than that, diversity, right? Diversity. Your kids should understand that there are tons of different religions. There are Islamic people, there are Jewish people, there are Catholic people, there are Christian people, there's all types of people, and that doesn't make them very different than you, and it doesn't ever make them automatically good or bad people. It just makes them people. And we have to try to create a space for more diversity and to have more of these experiences, and that will help us with the next generation be more understanding of everybody, but in a way of spreading love, not through spreading hate, not through spreading violence, not through any aggression.
If I can kind of put a capstone on that, one of the things that we've talked about on this program before, and Bill, you've done a lot of great work here at Sutherland on this, is that idea of religious pluralism and just pluralism in general. The United States is an idea that people from different backgrounds, different belief systems can come together under a shared overall principled framework of individual liberty, civil rights, and protection of those God-given rights, but they can still live their own lives in different ways as long as it's within that overarching principled framework. And so that pluralism, that diversity that you're talking about, where people from all walks of life and all religious denominations can live peacefully and happily here in America because of that bedrock principle in our Constitution and our law and in our culture of religious pluralism and those protections. And Bill, that's something that you've written a lot about. Anything you would add to that this fundamental American idea we're talking about, how do we as Americans who believe in this American ideal push back against anti-Semitism?
Well, I think all of us probably have the experience, if we look carefully at our lives, of times where we feel a little ashamed that someone was being misrepresented or mistreated, and we wish we had said something. And I think this is maybe kind of a gut check moment for all of us to say, I may be in a conversation with someone and they may say something like the Jews or something, where I might just let it go, but I oughtn't to. I shouldn't do that. I was involved actually in some religious training yesterday as a lay member, and the phrase that was used I thought was really powerful is it has to end now, and it has to end with me. So each one of us has to say, I'm not gonna just stand by and let people say things like that. I've got to speak up. Of course, if we're in a position to make policy, we should do things to be welcoming as well. But I think for most people who are in this podcast, they're having conversations with neighbors. Maybe their kids are coming home from school and they've heard college and they've heard things that are reprehensible, and they need to push back a little bit and say, no, whatever you think about these issues, there's never an excuse for attitudes that of anti-Semitism or any other bias or racism or any of those kinds of things. But if we each stop and we all are serious about challenging those who make comments or hold beliefs like that, I think we could make an enormous difference over time.
You mentioned college campuses, and a lot of these protests or statements from students or even in leadership seem to be kind of anchored around college campuses, universities, or many law schools, for example. So just kind of that broad question of when major institutions of American civil society, and in this case universities and law schools, seem to have an issue with this kind of anti-Semitism, what should the response be from those institutions to this? Rabbi, any thoughts on that? What would you love to see from these institutional leaders?
America is the land of the free. We said a few times. People have the right to protest. They do. I might not appreciate it. You might not appreciate it. But they have the right to protest. And if the colleges would go and shut down pro-Israel protests, we would be also up in arms. An institution is not responsible for the protests of their students necessarily. I think what's lacking is leadership from the college. BYU here, and I'm not saying every college has to do this, BYU lowered every single flag they had on campus for a full week to half staff, in addition to any statements they put out. These colleges didn't say a word about it. They said the conflict in the Middle East. There's no conflict. There was peace on October 6th, and then terrorists came in and massacred a couple thousand people. So there has to be a strong statement from the leadership, and there has to be security in place to make sure that protests or demonstrations or marches don't become violent. Because end of the day, people are allowed to feel whatever they feel. That's part of what our Constitution is built on. Whether or not we're proud of those views people have, but we have to lead better, and we have to make sure that we're putting a system in place that it cannot lead to violence or aggression.
As we finish up, we're just about out of time, but I want to end on a positive, hopeful note. And Rabbi, some of the things that you've said and the things that you're doing in the community, I think can help give our listeners that sort of dose of optimism. So I wanted to ask you, especially speaking of institutions, like again, we're seeing at university campuses, and there's some real concern about why these things are cropping up there. But let's bring that institutional lens down to more the local level, and tell us briefly what you're doing with the Chabad of Utah County. First of all, for listeners who may not know, what is your organization? What are you trying to do? And can local institutions like the one that you're running here in Utah help be part of the antidote to some of this evil anti-Semitism that we see?
Yeah. Our organization is about a year old, Chabad of Utah County. We work in outreach in the Jewish community here, and I would say more than only the Jewish community, but we provide diversity in Utah County, giving a home for meaningful Jewish experiences year-round, be it holidays. Obviously, we've been pretty busy with the whole Israel situation, making sure our community feels safe and feel like they have a place to go and to talk it out and to be there for them. But 100%, these organizations, I think, are the key step one of the antidote, because we spoke about education. That's what we're here for. And there's thousands of these all around the country. You can Google your local Chabad, and many of them have been leading by example. I just saw a video on my way in of one of the college campuses where they hosted a Jewish singer and a not a rally, a concert of strengthening each other on campus. Obviously, these things cost money, but a festival, a way that people can come and see, first of all, we're not backing down. We're proud to be Jewish, and we want you and your kids to also be proud to be Jewish, and nothing's ever going to change that. They've hated us for years and years, and nothing's different now, but we could try to take steps to minimize that. So giving people a place to be proud Jewish people, and giving people who are not Jewish a chance to come learn in a way of love and respect what we're all about.
If people want to get involved or be supportive in some way of Chabad of Utah County, what's a good place for them to do that?
JewishUtahCounty.com. We're on Instagram, Jewish Utah County, Facebook, Chabad of Utah County, but Google us, you'll find us, and we're happy to get in touch.
Excellent. Well, Rabbi Zippel, thank you so much for lending your time and sharing your experiences on these, I think, really, really crucial viewpoints for our listeners to then take back to everything we say, everything we think and feel about this issue moving forward. There's a quote that I've heard invoked a couple times recently from former President Ronald Reagan, where he says that freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. And as you said, Rabbi, that never again is now. I think there's a convergence of those two ideas right now with this issue, that each of us as American citizens have to stand up against these kinds of evil ideas when they arise, and stand up in favor of these core American principles that we've been talking about that I think are worthy of defending. So I want to thank you again for being with us today and sharing all of this. And Bill, also thank you for spending your time with us and sharing your expertise looking at this through the historical and constitutional lens. So thank you both for being on Defending Ideas with us.
Sure. Thanks for having us.
Well, we have one more brief break before we leave you with some final talking points on this issue. You're listening to Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. I want to thank again our special guest, Rabbi Chaim Zippel, for joining us to share his experience and his insights on an issue that's very difficult yet crucial to talk about. The truly evil and barbaric attack on October 7th and the Israeli military's response has been all over the news and on social media. So it's pretty likely that you're probably going to end up talking about it with friends or family if you haven't already. Or perhaps it'll come up around the dinner table as you celebrate Thanksgiving with family and loved ones. Either way, if you end up in a discussion about these recent events, here are some things to remember from our conversation today with Rabbi Zippel and Bill Duncan. Number one, the United States of America is built on a set of principles. These principles define the very soul of our country, and one of those core principles is the right to live your faith and worship according to your beliefs. This simple notion of religious freedom, of pluralism, of tolerance, and respect for Americans who believe differently is a bedrock idea built into our Constitution, our laws, and our culture. The anti-Semitism we've seen so much of recently flies in the face of that bedrock American principle. Number 2, you can be an agent of change by being willing to defend the rights of people who may not share your religious beliefs. And that starts with being willing to oppose anti-Semitism, whatever its source. Number 3, as with any crucial and complicated topic, be willing to discuss it with family and friends. But start from a place of love, respect, and dignity toward those who think differently. We can stand up to ideas and beliefs that are wrong, but do it in a spirit of light and love rather than darkness or hate. Well, we hope you feel better empowered to defend the ideas we discussed today. If you liked what you heard on this episode, please visit defendingideas.org. You can find access to short clips from this episode that you can use on social media and in your conversations with friends and family. You can also access all of our previous episodes with experts and leaders like the ones we talked with today. Also, if you'd like to subscribe to the podcast, go to your favorite podcast provider like Apple, Google, Spotify. We're available on all those platforms. And type in Defending Ideas in the search bar and hit that subscribe button. And lastly, if you want to support the work of Sutherland Institute, please visit sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. We thank you for joining us for another episode of Defending Ideas this week. From the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City, I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.